we will go ahead and get started. So welcome this evening to our panel discussion. What is Roe versus Wade and what happens if it's overturned? So I really, on behalf of the entire Bay Path community, want to welcome you to this evening's panel discussion. As a women's college, we feel that it's really important to educate ourselves, our students, and our larger community on some of these really impactful issues of our day. So thank you for joining us and learning along with us. Before we begin, however, we were talking earlier as a panel, and I cannot help but acknowledge yesterday's events. It just weighs so heavily on our minds. You might remember 2 years ago was the murder of George Floyd. 10 days ago was the tragedy in Buffalo. There were lots of incidences in between, of course. And then yesterday, the event at an elementary school in Texas. And friends, some days it just feels very, very heavy. So we are again a community, a nation in mourning. And we're asking ourselves, why? Why again? When will it stop? What can we do? Particularly as educators, particularly as community members, it takes on a particular significance to us, I believe, an elementary school, elementary children, teachers. So I ask you all to join me, bow your heads for a moment of silence. Thank you. And thank you for joining me in keeping those families of those victims from the beginning of time, right? We really feel the intensity, the weight of this, keeping all those victims in our heart, in our prayers, in our minds. So thank you so much. I'd like to turn now to the business of this evening, which is Roe versus Wade. And before I introduce our moderator, Yvette. So thank you very much, Yvette. And I want to introduce you properly, but I just want to take a moment and remind us about Roe versus Wade. So Roe versus Wade was a landmark decision of the United States Supreme Court back in 1973. So really important in terms of timing, in which the United States Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution, so this is a really important distinction that we're going to hear about from some of our constitutional panelists tonight, that the Constitution of the United States protects a pregnant woman's liberty to choose to have an abortion without excessive government restriction, so that this right to privacy is balanced with the government's interest in the health and well-being of its citizens. So really important that for 50 years, this has been a constitutional right, which is why the impact of a potential overturning of this decision is really unusual. That's the first thing. The Supreme Court doesn't generally overrule itself on constitutional issues, so particularly significant. So why are we here today? In anticipation of a leaked initial draft of the majority opinion, which was leaked to Politico, penned by Justice Samuel Alito. The leaked document indicated that the court was poised to overturn this constitutional right, and that the decision is going to be announced sometime in June. So our conversation tonight is just good timing. We did it intentionally so that we could all prepare and be knowledgeable about what the Supreme Court may do in June. So I just want to remind everybody that this conversation is being recorded. We have a number of people who reached out to us tonight saying, either they're at a Ukrainian fundraiser or it's a political fundraiser. They're in class, as many of our students are. So we are going to make this available, closed captioned, to anyone who is interested. So Yvette Frisbee, Vice President of Administrative Services and Youth Development for the Urban League of Springfield, Inc. Yvette, you serve on various boards and committees relative to your work at the Urban League and have a passion for the development of young girls and women. You currently serve on Bay Path University's advisory board, thank you very much, an adjunct faculty member with our fully online adult program, which we call the American Women's College, so thank you very much, and you teach in Bay Path's WIL program. So thank you for your commitment both to Bay Path, but also to young women and girls. So Yvette, I will turn over to you, and we are so grateful that you are a moderator this evening.
Thank you for the introduction, President Doran. I'm thrilled to be here tonight to moderate this important conversation for our community. We've asked experts from the healthcare, legal, and community fields to join us tonight to lend their knowledge as we work towards a greater understanding of the current law, how the law came to be, and what's potentially at stake depending on the Supreme Court's ruling. Our panelists tonight include Attorney Elizabeth G. Deneen, the Executive Director of the YWCA of Western Massachusetts, Attorney Kathleen E. Dion, Partner, Robinson and Cole, Jamie Marie Clark, Certified Physician Assistant, Regional Medical Director, Primary Care for Hartford Healthcare, and also Dr. Courtney Patrick Weber, who is Bay Path Associate Professor of Rhetoric and Composition. We've had several pre-submitted questions that our panelists will address, and we're going to leave some time at the end to allow for Q&A. So if you have any questions as we go along, if you could please put them in the Q&A so that we can ask them at the end, that would be awesome. So panelists, to get started, let's talk about what's happening in the present moment that is making this conversation a necessity. Attorney Dion, can you explain what has really thrust Roe v. Wade back into the public conversation in such a large way?
Sure. So as President Doran mentioned, about 3 weeks ago, a draft opinion from the U.S. Supreme Court was leaked that indicated that the court was leaning towards overturning Roe versus Wade, which has created a lot of demonstrations and work across the country of people who are concerned about what that means for women's reproductive rights.
Thank you. Sorry, I had to unmute myself. Now, I want to start with all of the panelists. What does Roe v. Wade currently state now, and what does it regulate? And Attorney Dion, you may be a good person to answer that particular question.
Sure. So Roe versus Wade, as President Doran mentioned before, it held that the U.S. Constitution protects the right for a woman to get an abortion up to a limited circumstance, and they did that by separating a pregnancy into three different trimesters. And what they said is during basically the first 2 trimesters that states couldn't put undue restrictions on a woman's right to get an abortion up until the essentially when the 3rd trimester started, and they felt that that meant that the fetus was viable at that point, as a way of sort of balancing out the rights of a woman's right to decide what happens with her own body, and which they held under privacy implied right into the Constitution, versus what others had argued is the right of the unborn child, and to when their rights begin as a person under the Constitution. I should just, I guess, mention that Roe versus Wade was subsequently sort of modified by a future case, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which sort of changed that trimester framework a little bit, but the concepts were generally the same, as up to what the court felt was viability as a time period when states couldn't put an undue burden on when women could get an abortion, and then after viability is when they said that states had more freedom to restrict that.
Thank you. And the next is a 2-part question. So it's part legal and then part also what will happen within our specific community. So any of the panelists can answer this question and weigh in on it. What exactly will happen legally if Roe versus Wade is overturned? And then the other part of that is, what can we expect to see happen in our communities? So anyone can weigh in on that particular question.
I can start with the legal aspect and then others can jump in if that's easier. So the draft opinion that was leaked, right now, if it's accepted in whole by the court, would it throw back to the states the ability to decide essentially what the state is going to consider when life begins, and thus what their restrictions are going to be on as far as, and leave to the states to decide what their own abortion laws should be, as opposed and essentially overrule what they had found about the privacy aspects and the constitutional viability of whether or not that's a fundamental right for women who are seeking an abortion.
So for some additive input from Kathleen, what Roe v. Wade did for women was essentially ensure safe access to an abortion if that is what they chose to do, and that's if that what they chose to elect with an unwanted or unintended pregnancy. And so the safety component, I think, is incredibly important, because if that is overturned and then left up to individual states to prohibit or to put restrictions on, what that does is that then can lead to unsafe procedures, which has undue outcome. I have my daughter here hanging out, sorry, which has undue consequences to the state of the mother and of an unborn child. So, I think it's important to understand the safety aspect of a before and after potential situation.
Thank you. And Attorney Deneen, did you want to weigh in on that in terms of working at the YWCA? What we could expect to see happen within our communities? Is that something you want to take?
I think that for particularly low-income women and women of color, it could be catastrophic. For the medically and psychologically, I think that it could also be very difficult for young women in particular who might not be ready to be a mother. So we have teen mothers, 2 facilities here for teen mothers, and sometimes people, for various reasons, that could be range from someone being raped and not knowing that they were pregnant for a couple of months, and making a decision later in their pregnancy to have an abortion because they feel as though they're too young, or they do not want to raise a child that's a product of a rape. It could be very, very catastrophic. And I do agree with Ms. Clark that what will happen is there'll be an increase of unsafe abortions, because women will try either to abort the child themselves, or they will try to do whatever necessary to obtain an abortion if they feel that that is their only option. And we could go really backwards in terms of having people that are not medically trained to perform abortions, which could result in death or to the mother, or significant problems if the abortion failed and the child survived.
Thank you. Dr. Patrick Weber, did you want to weigh in on this as well?
Yes, I definitely agree with you about it being catastrophic. We talk about choice a lot, but unfortunately, the idea of choice suggests this individual power that we can decide what we want to do. We can move out of these states if we want to move out of these states, but a lot of conditions around choice are oppressive and racist, including like the cost of abortion, the availability of abortion clinics, geographical restrictions, all the laws that are suddenly being passed lately that are more restrictive. And it all ties into access issues. You know, I was looking it up, and according to the CDC in 2019, Black women had the highest rate of abortions with 23.8 abortions per 1,000 women. The white women had the lowest rate, so 6.6 abortions per 1,000 women. So Black and brown pregnant people are going to suffer the most from this. They already suffer the most through maternal mortality rates that are ridiculously high for the US, but when you factor race into the equation, non-Hispanic Black women are 2.9 times the rate of non-Hispanic white women to die from maternal related deaths. So to say catastrophic, I would say that is a pretty accurate term for what this means.
Thank you. And then how does this potential decision, and I know that you all spoke to it a little bit, but let's talk specifically about Massachusetts and then maybe some other states. How does this potential decision to revoke Roe versus Wade affect those of us in Massachusetts and other states where abortion is legal at the state level? Attorney Dion, do you want to speak to that for me?
Sure. So in the states where the state law already is consistent with what Roe versus Wade has here, which is that up to a certain point in the pregnancy, a woman could get an abortion, then there's probably going to be no change. But what we've seen is once it appeared like the Supreme Court was shifting more towards the right, states that previously to Roe versus Wade probably had laws on the books that outlawed abortion, and they have their populations and support going back to those laws. If Roe versus Wade's overturned, have already started making those laws now, both partially to challenge Roe versus Wade while they think the court is in their favor, but also in preparation for if the court does overturn them, then they already have the laws in place that'll put those restrictions on.
Thank you. Did anyone else want to weigh in on that? I see a lot of heads nodding. That's why I'm asking the question.
I think it's easy for us to think we're safe, but we're not. You know, we can't be complacent with this. We can't say it's an us versus them issue. We can't say that's just a problem for those states and those people down there. If it will come, if it hasn't yet, it affects us all. And if we're not fighting for people, for all the rights of pregnant people, then we're not really fighting.
Well, what's also interesting is, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to.
Oh no, I was just gonna say, we just can't be complacent and be like, oh, we'll be fine. Yeah.
You know, I think it's really interesting to think about, you know, the states who tend to run a little bit more blue and democratic in terms of, you know, abortion rights, because I think what we also have to consider is the burden that this actually may place on the healthcare systems within states who have a legalized process. You know, people are going to fly. I think we're seeing examples in corporate America where, you know, employers are more than willing to help still provide a choice for a woman. And if that means supporting travel costs, et cetera, where are they going to travel to? They're going to travel to the places where, you know, where it's allowed. And, you know, I wonder, and I'm curious about the conceptions, I guess, of, we're now having border crossing within the United States, right? So now we're forcing women to cross a border intercontinentally. What right, you know, what responsibilities do we have as human beings to take care of our fellow, you know, our fellow women? So if I have women coming to me for care from Texas, from Arkansas, personally, I mean, doesn't bother me at all. But I do wonder where the cost is going to come from in terms of the you know, the impetus of you know, paying for that, and whose responsibility is that going to be in the long run?
Thank you. Thank you. And this might tie into the next question too, where we're asking, there's a lot of talk about citizen enforcement of abortion laws in Texas. Could this spread in other states and other laws? Dr. Patrick Weber, I see you raising your, nodding your head. So can you please respond to that first?
Yes, I think it can. I know a lot of states are looking at passing laws where they can criminalize people and for crossing these borders, can criminalize the abortion providers across borders. They're trying to make it difficult to mail, like the abortion pill. There are all these laws that are starting to get passed or trying to get passed that are going to make it very difficult for people to cross the borders when they want to. And again, it's also an access issue. People, if they have enough money, they'll be fine. They can cross those borders and get around the laws. But again, the people that it's going to hurt the most are the ones with the lower socioeconomic status, and the ones that need it the most won't be able to. So there's a lot of issues with that too.
I think something that needs to be stated also is that it basically kind of promotes sue thy neighbor. Sue thy neighbor, because if somebody, the Texas law bans abortion 6 weeks into pregnancy, and it allows anyone in the United States to sue abortion providers or others who help a woman get the procedure after 6 weeks. So we could have lawsuits going on, neighbor turning against neighbor, relative turning against relative. It's really again, it's I say the word catastrophic, but it's horrible. It kind of brings you to start thinking about Handmaid's Tale, the show, because it's really pitting people against each other in a very, very negative way, and turning people in and exposing people for making that decision and shaming them, and then trying to make a financial profit out of it by suing them.
Thank you. Kate, Attorney Dion, from a legal perspective, what are your thoughts on citizen enforcement of abortion laws in Texas and how it can spread to other states in other laws?
I think from an enforcement perspective, it would be very difficult. So what we would have, when you have one neighbor that can tell on another neighbor, as Attorney Deneen was saying, you also foresee a lot of situations where people aren't telling the truth, or it's hard to track down what people know or who's telling on whom and for what motivation. And so, we have statutes now that require people to tell on other people. I mean, we have the mandatory reporter statutes that in certain circumstances to protect children that we have, that people in certain professions like Jamie's are required to actually report on people. But those have all in place both a safe harbor provision for people who are reporting in good faith to protect a child, but also there's a penalty that if you report on someone not in good faith, that you could be held liable for the consequences of that action. And I think at least the Texas one, which goes kind of beyond and isn't as well thought out as that process, I think, that gets into a very gray area that we probably haven't dealt with here, but I think comes with a lot more problems that have already been worked out.
Thank you. Jamie, do you want to weigh in on this one?
I mean, I just echo, what Kate said. I think one thing that I kind of wanted to highlight was, as medical practitioners, we're really starting, and I have to thank the pandemic for this, it's really highlighted, I think, we're looking at social determinants of health now, right? So it's not just about your blood pressure and your pulse and your cholesterol levels or your sugar levels, but I now want to know, and I've started to ask my patients, and I've been enjoying the responses, what's your trauma? We all have trauma. We all have a story. It affects us at all points of our life. And I think what I'm most concerned about is the impact of an unwanted pregnancy on the mental health of a female. And I think that is something that is not being discussed a lot with our policymakers. I think the policymakers are reacting in a here and now situation and not looking forward to, pregnancy coercion, spousal abuse, partner abuse, interrelationship pressure, and all of these things added on to an unwanted pregnancy is going to cause significant mental health. And, I think we've all heard the term, a happy mom is a happy baby. And I think that if you have a female who is, forced to have an unwanted pregnancy, it is an absolute detriment to the health. Statistically speaking, a controlled abortion in today's society is very safe. Compared to an actual pregnancy. We are not one to boast about high maternal bad outcomes, I guess I can say. We are not very good at that. And so you're actually 14 times more likely to die in childbirth than you are to have an abortion. But, I think stressing the mental health aspect, and now you're actually layering on a citizen state to that, I think is going to be, a really sad and traumatic experience that will last generations, because you're going to have generational trauma because of this. And, another thing I wanted to mention too, that I think, from a medical standpoint, I find fascinating about this is, the vaccines really highlighted one's right to choose. And we are cherry picking who can have that right to choose. I can choose to put 5 chemicals into my body that protect against a virus, but I can't choose if I want some cells to be removed from my body in an initial couple weeks of pregnancy. So I think the dichotomy there is really dysfunctional. And, again, from a medical standpoint, we want the right to choose. I think that's fine. People don't want a vaccine. That, again, is your right to choose. I just think that we need to be careful if we're medicinally going to be cherry picking those arguments, because medicine is science at the crux of it. It's not really opinion based. I want people to make informed decisions and informed decisions about their body, and whatever you live with is you're the conductor. You drive your train. So that was a little tangent off of that, but that's been running through my mind.
And much appreciated. Thank you. Thank you. And based on all of your responses, let me ask you this. Could Congress pass a federal law protecting abortion rights and supersede the Supreme Court? Is that a possibility?
It's definitely a possibility. In fact, there's a bill right now that the Democrats have introduced, and it's really to codify Roe. It's called the Women's Health Protection Act, and it defines abortion as interstate commerce. And what the Democrats are trying to do right now in Congress is follow what happened with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. At that time, Congress was mobilized to enforce anti-discrimination requirements in public accommodations like hotels, restaurants, and they used the Commerce Act to try to have that legislation enacted, because they said Congress has the right to regulate commerce between the states. And if people are going to restaurants, then there has to be food possibly transported across state lines to the restaurants. If people are going to go to hotels, you're going to drive from one state to another state to go to a hotel to visit a landmark destination. So they were successful in passing that legislation because of the Supreme Court agreed that the Commerce Act was protected the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Unfortunately, over the years, our Supreme Court has become much more conservative than it was in 1964 when that took place. And our country has become more divided in terms of, or more polarized, I guess, in terms of this issue. And so many people are trying to say, if you want to get an abortion, the medical equipment could be transported across states. The medication use could be transported across states. The equipment itself, the table, etc. So they're trying to use the Commerce Act to once again to pass this legislation. And unfortunately, I think there's a big difference between now and 1964, because if this legislation did manage to get passed, and someone appealed it to the Supreme Court, or there was some type of, it made its way up because people were upset. Right now, we know there's probably 6 justices who would say, no deal, because of the leak. So the answer is yes, but it probably won't happen, no matter how organized or tenacious the Democrats are in trying to promote that theory.
Thank you. Any other thoughts? Thank you, Attorney Deneen. And then, we really want to talk about how do we have conversations with people we care about who may view the topic of abortion differently than we do. Jamie, you want to start with this one?
I mean, yeah. So I think that it does come back to the right to choose and make a decision about your body. I have, personal experience with family members whom we don't necessarily agree, on a political, social level. But I also just use facts. I use science and I use data. The American College of Obstetrics and gynecologists have really great resources. It is a bit of a stance, but it does give great data on, abortion being a safe medical intervention, safer than many common, medical procedures. And I think I would always, discuss again, the mental health capacity of a female. They're not easy conversations to have, but I also do believe in understanding someone else's point of view and having separate realities. My reality is very different than somebody else's. I look at life from a medical standpoint a lot. And I have to sometimes understand that some don't, and that's okay. But I think that having, civil discourse and civil rhetoric is a way to make the change. I think that as people go through life and have experiences themselves, and, no one unfortunately can predict in today's world what can happen. Women still have to not run at nighttime. Sexual assaults are underreported. Those situations happen all the time, and unfortunately it's random, and you never know what situation you're going to find yourself in. And so time will really tell, I think. And it's okay to agree to disagree on some of these issues, which is I've learned, because for protecting your own peace, I think is actually very important. I've learned that, in protecting my own sanity. I state my side, and someone states their side, and that's okay if we don't agree. Removing the anger out of it will help you heal if decisions come down the line that you don't agree with.
Thank you. And Dr. Patrick Weber, what about you? How do we have conversations with people that may view abortion differently than we do? Whether we agree with it or not, how do we have those conversations?
Well, I definitely think it's important, because I think our lack of talking about abortion is one of the reasons that led us to where we are. A lot of people don't know about the different types of abortion. They don't know about the law. So it's great that there's people here And because there's kind of like a silence around it, I mean, even professors won't, when they assign research papers, they'll make a list of things you can't write about, and one of them is usually abortion. And I think this is a mistake because it feeds into that stigma of abortion, of the stigma of who has abortions, who gets the procedure and who doesn't. There's like a veil of mystery around it that a lot of people don't understand it. So they automatically think the worst, or they buy into whatever they see on these ads or whatever like propaganda they look at. So I think we do need to talk about it. It is that A word that needs to be talked about. And I agree that you won't go into these discussions winning. Like, think of it as a way to seek for that person to at least consider your point of view, at least plant the seed of nuance into their brain, get them at least considering that maybe they don't know everything there is to know about it. I also agree with Jamie about bringing in facts and statistics. You might also ask why they feel the way they do, what values might be behind that, and how you can talk to them about those values. You might even ask if they know anyone who has had an abortion. And if they don't know anyone, ask them to read about these stories. There's lots of people who've written about their abortions that, you can search for them online. Really get them to remember of the pregnant person behind the abortion, that how each person is different, to have empathy for that person and their families and what they're going through, why they chose to get it. Know that there's so many different reasons, just as like there's so many different types of people out there. Constantly remind them it's a public health issue. Again, come with facts and statistics, and know that you won't have the answers to everything they ask you, but push back against any one policy fits all scenario. We don't know every person's story and can't assume for them. And so I guess just try to humanize it, remind them of the pregnant people and their families behind them, ask them why they feel the way they feel, and just know and set those boundaries too for yourself, because there's going to be a part where you're just going to realize, you know what, I can't do this. And, you took the time, you tried, you at least got them to hear a little bit of what you have to say, and that can be a big thing.
Thank you. And I think this is one of those questions where you all probably can weigh in and have an opinion on it. So Attorney Deneen, what are your thoughts on having conversations with people that have a different view of ours?
I think, you can't start a conversation with the intent to change their mind. It's really just to understand their point of view. And I agree with what's already been stated. Just try to understand, seek to understand and be empathetic. We're so polarized in this nation on so many different issues. And we need, Jamie used the word civil discourse. We need to start to learn to patiently, kindly, empathetically listen to each other and try to seek to understand.
Thank you. Attorney Dion, do you have anything that you would like to add to this?
Sure. I have conversations with people on a different viewpoint every day, since that's what I do. So I think one thing that has been helpful, I've found in having both these conversations and others, is finding common ground where you agree, and then explaining what your position is, sort of calmly and without talking over the other person, and with hearing what they're saying and responding to it. I think sometimes the more unpleasant and unproductive conversations in this area is when people are talking over each other and they aren't hearing what the other person is saying, and in response to that. And then I think the other thing that's important is to just, the more educated you are about what your position is and why that is, and how, and not necessarily just like a yes or I feel this way or no, I don't, but also supporting that with some examples that may not necessarily be apparent to the other person. So in this case, some of the very compelling stories that I've heard are about people, everybody's story. I think the story, a lot of times the conversation around abortion sort of centers on, should someone be able to say like yes or no? And just like for whatever reason, it's almost sort of like as like a whim of whether or not they want to do this or not. But, sometimes the way some of the laws are written, it prohibits people from making medical decisions that are actually really important. Sometimes the law doesn't take into account like what happens afterwards. And there's a lot of aspects to that, I think, that actually make it, if you take a tact that the other person is not expecting, as opposed to just saying, well, this is about this, which is more important to me than your belief that, this is a right to life, or your belief that this is a right to choose, and then sort of explaining out why that is.
Thank you. And that, what you say ties nicely into the next question when we're talking about making medical decisions and how they impact community. So we're going to particularly talk about community resources, because we all know there's a limited amount of community resources for babies, children, families. So if abortion becomes illegal, what type of impact will these additional 2-term pregnancies and children place on our community resources? And who would like to be the first to respond to that? What's the impact on our community resources?
I mean, I'm not sure where you really begin to formulate a plan. Again, I think it's the cart before the horse, that is not being considered when the policymakers are discussing these changes. But from a community standpoint, the pandemic has highlighted, we are strapped when it comes to access. Telemedicine has helped, but specifically access to mental health, psychiatry, psychology, and social workers. And, what I worry about is, the effect, not just as a baby, but in those formative years as a child, as a 2, 3, 4, 5-year-old growing up, as an unwanted child in an unwanted, situation. And to be fair, I may be passing judgment. I could completely be passing judgment on someone. I'm just assuming that someone who didn't want a child will forever not show a child love. But the potential is there. The potential is there for poor outcomes. I worry about the generational trauma. I think I mentioned that earlier. That will trickle down. In terms of, I'm hoping that we're much more of an open society in talking about mental health these days. I think that the amount of patients that I have seen in the past year and a half who are very much more open about talking about anxiety and depression and their feelings has been a great turn. But I worry that as medical professionals struggle within the medical system and the healthcare system as it is, which is poorly designed, strapped as it is, how we're going to be able to handle a volume and uptick of, the downstream effects is up in the air. I don't think it's a predictable situation, to be honest with you.
Thank you. Attorney Deneen, coming from a community perspective in serving women and girls, what are your thoughts?
I'm terrified because during the pandemic, when people were trapped at home with their abusers, domestic violence went through the roof. Our domestic violence shelter was filled to capacity every day. We had to rent a floor of a hotel in Springfield and in Enfield to house people and get additional funding from the state and from the Western Mass Community Foundation, because it was an endless stream of women coming here because they were abused. I can only imagine if people are forced to have a baby with a partner that, and they don't want to have that baby, the escalation in domestic violence. And then the other thing that increased in our state and in Western Mass in particular was a spike in child abuse during the pandemic. yes, kids were at home and they didn't have the advantage of being seen by their teachers who were mandatory reporters, or actually going sometimes to the doctor or their PA who would see them and were mandatory reporters. But we have 4 full-time social workers here that work in a program dealing with children, helping children who have witnessed or experienced violence. And we have 300 kids on a wait list right now. And that is as a result, again, of the pandemic and an increase in child abuse and domestic abuse. So if you're a child that's not wanted, if you're forced to have a child because you don't have options, I just see increased stress and mental health breakdowns, and unfortunately, children and women becoming victimized and having to find ways to cope.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I know that we have quite a few questions that are in the chat, which only lets us know that this is a really critical conversation to be having, particularly at this time. Melissa, did you want to address the questions that are in the chat from the audience right now? Okay.
Sure, thank you. This has been a wonderful conversation. We've had several questions come in. And so our first one is there anything that can be done by anyone in the government to stop the Supreme Court from overturning Roe v. Wade?
I guess I'll take that one. No, the legislature cannot prevent the Supreme Court from deciding something one way or the other. It's part of the checks and balances that the Constitution has in place, where one branch can't sort of tell the other branch what to do. As Attorney Deneen mentioned, there is pending legislation. I think it's been pending since at least last year, trying to create a federal law on that aspect. But the likelihood of that getting through Congress is highly unlikely at this time.
Thank you. Our next question is, what privacy rights would be in jeopardy against individuals who have had an abortion from being discriminated against across various sectors if Roe versus Wade is overturned, such as in the workplace, healthcare, et cetera?
This is a fabulous question. And it's really going to be dependent on whether or not, certain states encourage whistleblowers. However, my hope is that HIPAA, which is, Health Insurance Privacy and Portability Act, would protect you from keeping your medical information private from your employer. I'm not sure what that would mean in terms of you willingly tell Amazon that, I would like to get an abortion, and then Amazon can, covertly help you out. However, I would like to think that, your medical records will still stay extremely private to you. And your workplace would not have access to that without your illicit permission. So, it would depend on you keeping your information private. And if it's vocalized and there's a whistleblower, in effect, then that's the repercussions of there. But I do worry about the mandated reporting, because there is a system, it's called the REMS system within the federal government about the distribution of mifepristol, which is one of the main abortive pills, and they can track this, right? So you have to be specially certified in order to dispense this medication, and certain protocols and mitigation protocols have to be followed, and so that's trackable. So if that medication is being ordered or dispensed and there's records, it's terrifying in the fact that it's a little Big Brother-esque, and sometimes it's very heavy to think about. But at a baseline, my hopes is that HIPAA will still protect you.
Thank you very much. Another question that's come in, and I'm not sure if anyone will be able to speak to this, but we'll throw it out there and see. What would happen if an indigenous community were to become a safe haven for abortion care, but they were in a state that banned abortion? I believe this is a current issue that is transpiring in Oklahoma.
So if by indigenous community, we mean like a reservation, then generally the state laws don't apply to the reservation because they have their own laws that are state laws would not necessarily apply to reservation land because they're considered to be their own sovereign states, but federal laws do apply to them. So if the concern is that what would happen, it's like in Oklahoma, if Oklahoma state creates its own laws, then those likely would not apply on the reservation land. However, again, if we have the sort of community reporting aspect of it, it does create an interesting question that I don't know the answer to about what happens if someone on the reservation or reports on someone who is not on the reservation or vice versa, and what does that mean under the state law?
Thank you. A question we had submitted earlier, let me just go pull this up, is how will this affect IVF and infertility treatments?
Yeah, that's another really great question. I was thinking about that one for a little bit on a pre-submitted, in the pre-submitted list. So when a woman goes through IVF, eggs are harvested, sperm is taken, and then in vitro, meaning in a lab and in a petri dish, conception and fertilization fertilization of the sperm and the egg occur. Typically during a harvesting situation where, the gynecologist would go in and remove follicles from a female ovary, multiple are usually taken. And you've probably heard that sometimes, you can have fertilized eggs on ice for an undetermined amount of time. And this is a sticky situation. At that point of fertilization, it's a clump of cells. Medically speaking, it's a clump of cells, but with the definition that is being garnered, I think, with policymakers, if we're to call the clump of cells the point of fertilization as the starting point and when the clock ticks, then IVF centers have to really rectify what is then done with those eggs on ice and those fertilized eggs on ice that, it just so happened we have to statistically group together some sperm and some eggs, whichever takes to give you the best odds, because we need backup in case, the first run of implantation doesn't take. We need statistics to help a woman conceive on her own and use IVF. But if a woman says, I have twins or I have triplets and I have maybe another one on ice and I don't elect to have that implanted, is that considered an abortion? Is that considered then homicide, which I think has come up? But I think it becomes really important in conversations about the definition between a clump of cells and a formed organism with vital organs, etc. We didn't get a chance to get into that tonight, but that whole embryology process and anatomical process is quite important when having those discussions.
Thank you so much, Jamie. We're at just about 5 minutes left, and there are several questions we haven't been able to get to. Again, as our wonderful moderator stated, this really is indicative of just how needed this conversation is. So I'd love to just go from panelists to panelists. Any final thoughts you'd like to share before we wrap up in a couple minutes?
I have a thought. I really want any young woman or middle-aged woman or older woman, all women watching this, to think about running for office, to think about supporting candidates who support your point of view. I think it's time for women to start to lead. It's great that we have a president of a woman president of a college. We have many women in situations, leadership positions throughout our community in law firms and medical and education, etc. But we need educated, strong women running for office who are strong. It's time for the men to like step aside. I can't tell you how much I feel that, or the men to really be our allies, because we're in trouble.
I think the only additive comment that I would make that makes, I think, this discussion and adds, some flavor and layer is the separation of church versus state. I think we didn't really touch upon that. In medicine, we don't have religion. You can have your own perspective, but when it comes to the body, I think it gets murky. I believe in spirituality, in a person's right to choose their spirituality. But I do think keeping politics and religion out of medicine and out of females making the decisions about their body is really important. I think you can have your own belief of not ever wanting to choose an abortion. I think that's great if that's what you prefer. But leveraging separate realities, that not every individual in this country is a Christian or a Catholic or a Jewish individual or a Muslim. We are all very different. And I think having a broad stroke in policy making is throwing us, back hundreds of years.
I think, Jamie, what you said is really interesting, because from a legal perspective, the leaked opinion, but also, I guess, sort of the discussion that occurred both before and after that, which is also sort of centered on the role of religion and law and where they intersect and where they don't, is really unique when it comes to abortion law, because what the leaked opinion really focuses on is who gets to decide when a person is a person and when they are not. And I think, if the opinion were to be accepted as it is in its entirety, which would be unusual, I think, and it'll probably be changed in some aspects before it gets released. But the current opinion, the way it's drafted, sort of is drafted in a way that suggests that Roe versus Wade and then the cases that came after it think of a fetus as it comes along as sort of a hypothetical person, and they basically reject that holding and send it back to say that they're saying that the states can decide when we consider a fetus to be a person under the law, but it also sort of itself says it's rejecting that, and that the law that's before them says that a fetus is a person long before that, and then that's why they're doing it. And it presents really interesting questions from a legal aspect as to who gets to decide that and when and under what context, because I can't think of any other sort of area, any other opinions that have that sort of uncertainty as to who gets to decide probably the most important aspect of that's like the cornerstone of where that decision comes from.
And I would add that I think that it's great that we're having this conversation, that we're saying the A word, abortion, and that, we're taking like risk to talk about it and to be so open about it. And I think we need to keep having these discussions. We need to keep talking about it. We need to keep learning about it, reading about it, educating ourselves and others about it. And never forget the pregnant people behind these laws, which you mentioned, Jamie, with mental health issues. It's so true. And I think, with the advent of ultrasound, it's kind of enlarged the idea of the fetus to the point where it takes over the identity of the pregnant person, and they kind of lose their autonomy, and they no longer are that person anymore. They're just a vessel. And I think when we start treating them like that, which we kind of are, we forget the very real trauma emotionally, physically. I mean, pregnancy and childbirth is violent. It's not pretty if you've ever been through it or if you've ever seen it. it's a trauma. And you never fully recover from it physically. And emotionally, you're a different person. There's just so much that happens, and we kind of forget about that pregnant person and all these conversations, and we got to remember that person.
All right, well, thank you. This has just been a fascinating conversation. I know I've learned a lot, so I hope the audience will join me in thanking Courtney and Jamie and Katie and Liz and Yvette for being our panelists. Thank you all. This was just a phenomenal panel. We are so grateful for you for sharing your expertise. And friends, I'm going to propose that we probably need to do this in another couple of months once the opinion is available, and see really what are the ramifications and the interpretations. So thank you so much, and thank you to our audience for joining us. It's very, on behalf of BayPath, these are the issues that we want to be talking about because they affect women, children, men, our society at large. So thank you very much.
Thank you.